Very warm welcome to all of you here on behalf of the India International Society for 18th Century Studies. So today's annual talk is by Professor Purushottam Agrawal, and he's going to talk to us about on vernacular modernity and its evolution in Bhakti poetry. So we're greatly honored that Professor Agrawal has graciously accepted our invitation to deliver a talk today on the IISECS annual talk. And also thanks to my colleague and friend, Dr. Prof Shweta, who is so graciously again agreed to be the discussant for this session. To all our respected colleagues, students, and fellow members of IISECS and friends who have taken your time out to attend today's talk, a very, very warm welcome and thank you so much for your support. Thanks especially for waiting for these 10-15 minutes till we could just fix this up. So just to introduce you to our society, International Society for 18th Century Studies is a well-established and very prestigious organization. It is currently composed of more than 30 national societies. The International Congress meets every 4 years in different international venues and attracts attendances which are sometimes more than 1,000 or 2,000 scholars from around the world. So the last International Congress was held in Edinburgh, which was in 2019, and the next one is scheduled to be in Rome in 2023. So the purpose of our society, which is the Indian chapter of the International Society, is to advance interest in the study of the culture and history of the 18th century within India. It encourages research and investigation on a broad interdisciplinary basis in the region, and it acquaints students of the 18th century with Indian scholarship in this field. We hold this conference every year in March, and these have been enthusiastically attended by both early career scholars as well as established academicians. The themes of these conferences, we try to explore a range of pertinent changes that have happened in this very exciting era of Indian history. And we try to gain an insight into various areas like art, commerce, language and literature, gender relations, and education, and so on. So based on the conference papers, we are happy to say that we have come up with an edited volume, which is titled Mapping India, Transitions and Transformations, 18th to the 19th Century. This was published last year in 2019 by Routledge. And this year, we are again coming out with another volume, which is titled Making the Woman, Discourses in Gender in 18th Century India. So our membership is open to everyone. All of you are very welcome to join our society. It's usually in the month of March that we open membership. So all enthusiasts of 18th century studies are very, very welcome to join. So please also do join us on the IISECS Facebook page, which will keep you updated on the forthcoming events which we organize by the Indian Society as well as by the international societies. So today's talk by Dr. Purushottam Agrawal will be followed by a half an hour question and answer session. So the audience is requested to put in your questions in the chat box, latest by 5:15. I mean, till the time that he is talking, you can put your questions in the chat box. And then Rajima Sharma is our IISECS executive member, and she will coordinate the questions and then invite the audience to ask questions. So I now invite our IISECS Vice President, Dr. Amba Pandey, to introduce the speaker and the discussant.
Thank you, Shutapa. Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Friends, this good evening, and this is a matter of absolute pleasure and a privilege for me to invite Professor Purushottam Agrawal amongst us. I was a student when he was a professor at JNU. Although I was not a student of literature, but he was as popular among all the disciplines, I tell you, and we very eagerly looked forward to his lectures whenever it used to be in JNU, in different hostels and in the evenings, and on different matters, not only on literature. It was on social issues, political issues, everything. Professor Agrawal, whenever he was there, we were eagerly waiting for that lecture. So it is a matter of absolute privilege for me to invite Professor Agrawal today. Born in 1955, Prof Purushottam Agrawal served as a member of Union Public Service Commission of India from 2007 to 2013. Before this, he was a professor and chairperson in the Center of Indian Languages, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has also been a visiting professor at the Faculty of Oriental Studies, Cambridge University, and at the El Colegio de Mexico. He is a British Academic Fellow at Wolston College at University of Cambridge. Professor Agrawal has been emphasizing the decisive importance of vernacular sources for an authentic understanding of Indian history and society. And perhaps this lecture is an extension of that. That's the theory that he carries forward. He writes in Hindi as well as in English. His book, Akhat Kahani Prem Ki, Kabir in Kavita aur Unka Samay, published in 2009, has been widely acclaimed as a path-breaking study of Kabir and his work. Its Telugu translation was published in 2015. His other books include Hindi Sarai, Astrakhan via Verevan, a travelogue published in 2013, and Padmavat, the epic love story published in 2018. In 2016, he published his first novel, Nakuhas. This novel was also translated in Marathi and is being in the process of translation in English also. A well-known panelist in TV debates, Professor Agrawal hosted a unique show on the books called Kitab on the Rajya Sabha TV. One of his most celebrated talks on TV, also published as a monograph, was the Gandhi Peace Foundation lecture, Majbooti Ka Naam Mahatma Gandhi, which throws new light on the issues of violence and power. His latest book is Who is Bharat Mata? It was published in 2019, a selection from Nehru's writings and speeches about history, culture, and the idea of India. His weekly lectures on Facebook and YouTube are extremely popular and have attracted great audience. So all of us can actually take the privilege of following him on Facebook and YouTube. And friends, to take this lecture forward, we have amongst us Dr. Swati Sweta, who will be the moderator of this lecture. And Dr. Swati Sweta वर्तमान में दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय के गार्गी कॉलेज में सहायक प्रोफेसर हैं. आपका प्रारंभिक अध्ययन डीवीडी कॉलेज अमृतसर में हुआ है तथा उसके बाद उन्होंने गुरु नानक देव विश्वविद्यालय अमृतसर से अपनी पढ़ाई और पीएचडी पूरी की है. उन्होंने एमए हिंदी में भी किया है और अनुवाद में भी किया है और दोनों में इन्होंने गोल्ड मेडल स्वर्ण पदक प्राप्त किया है. डॉक्टर स्वाति श्वेता जी ने अपना आरंभिक लेखन कविता से किया और बाद में इनकी व्यंग कहानियां और भी बहुत सारे जो इनके लेखन हैं ये अनेक पत्र पत्रिकाओं में प्रकाशित हुए हैं. इन्होंने कई मंचों पर अपना काव्य पाठ, व्यंग्य पाठ और कविता पाठ किया है और इनके एक बहुत ही लंबी लिस्ट है इनकी कहानियों और इनके पब्लिकेशंस की. लेकिन एक जिसने मुझे बहुत ज़्यादा जिसने मेरा ध्यान आकर्षित किया है वो है राम की शक्ति पूजा. साहित्य शास्त्र, इसका जो साहित्य शास्त्र में इसका जो संदर्भ है इस पर इन्होंने एक किताब लिखी है. इसके अलावा इन्होंने भीष्म कहानी, कहे अनकहे संदर्भ और हिंदी का बहुयामी संदर्भ और भी बहुत सारी इनकी कविता और कहानियां प्रकाशित हुए हैं. तो मैं स्वागत करती हूँ आपका मैम, and I invite to take over, and I again invite Professor Agrawal. I welcome you, sir. It is a matter of extreme pleasure for us to have you amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you, Amba. Thank you so much. Once again, on behalf of India International Society of the 18th Century Studies, I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Purushottam Agrawal in this annual lecture on vernacular modernity and its evolution in Bhakti poetry. Now, straight away coming to my first issue. Sir, in your opinion, how did the print revolution contribute to the development of vernacular literature by establishing a direct link between the devotee and the divine?
Are we going to have question answer, or I'm supposed to say something for 40 minutes or whatever, and then you will be
discussing? No, we will be having a question answer type of thing.
Yeah, and we'll talk. I mean, Professor Agrawal will give us a talk for 45 minutes, and then maybe yes, of course, he will give a talk for 45 minutes, and then Swati, you could take up this question a little later after he's over with his presentation. Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you, sir. Please.
Shall I start now?
Yes, please, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Amba, for your kind words and reminding me of those exciting and ever-present actually days. That is not my past. JNU is always a present so far as I am concerned, and also a future. So thank you very much for reminding me of those wonderful days, those extended classrooms, which were classrooms even for me, not only for the students, in various late night meetings in hostels and Ganga Dhaba and Godavari Dhaba, and all those exciting discussions. Thank you, Sutapa, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody. It's really exciting to be talking to these enthusiastic young scholars of 18th century. 18th century is extremely significant. And I was really very happy to read the note which was sent to me about the purpose of the society, which states that it is to advance interest in the culture and history of 15th century within India, to encourage research and investigation in 18th century India. I find it rather interesting. I was just wondering, if I were to write this note, the word colonization will not be missing. Because the 18th century was also the century of colonization of India. And 18th century is important. I mean, the expression long 18th century, which has been used in your note, is obviously taken from European context. The long 18th century of enlightenment, starting in the last quarter of 17th century and going up to early 19th century. That is why they call it long 18th century. So the expression is obviously from the European context. But this long 18th century was not only the century of enlightenment and American and French Revolution, it was also the century of colonization, a very, very brutal colonization of non-Europe, of global South, Asia, Africa, and other places. The process was already on in Latin America, and it came to India and other places precisely in 18th century. So 18th century is a kind of Rubicon in our history. And I personally feel that you cannot understand, appreciate and engage with the issues and problems of 21st century without adequately engaging with the problems caused by 18th century colonization. And that is why I chose to talk about vernacular modernity. I wanted to speak on something. I wanted to speak on a particular text belonging to 16th century, because that is actually my core area of research, 16th, 15th century. So I wanted to talk about Dadu Janam Leela, a fascinating text. I am working on it in collaboration with Professor David Lorenzen. So I wanted to talk about that, but then Sutapa told me that it's probably too specialized a subject and let this be a talk of general interest. So I decided to talk about vernacular modernity in general. Now, Let me start with a very recently published and very popular book called Anarchy. Professor Rudranshu Mukherjee has written a fascinating review of that. It was printed or published in the online journal, the India Forum, in October 2019. The book Anarchy is about the anarchy in 18th century India, and the colonization, the loot. William Dalrymple informs us that the word loot enters the English lexicon because of the colonization. Loot is not an English word, originally speaking. So it comes from Indian language. Now it's an English word as well, because of colonization. But Rudranshu Mukherjee raises a very fundamental question. And that question is that was there really an anarchy in 18th century India? I mean, of course, the Mughal Empire was quite significantly weakened. And the authority of Mughals was almost symbolic. But what about Hyderabad? What about Mysore? What about Bengal or even Awadh? Were these areas suffering from the symptoms of anarchy? And if indeed there was an anarchy, this is the question Rudranshu Mukherjee raises. And this is the kind of question we should raise about the prevalent common sense about 18th century or about anything in the world. Will a commercial company, will a mercantile conglomerate venture into an anarchic society, into an anarchic situation for commerce? So this very idea of India being in an anarchy before the establishment and consolidation of British power through East India Company, this very idea is open to question. And this actually, I am talking of this because to my mind, it's symptomatic of a larger problem. And the larger problem has been, in a different context, indicated beautifully by Salman Rushdie in his In India Still Banned novel set in verses. In that novel, a particular character says in a context, and he is talking about Asians and Europeans. So he says he is an Asian. And he says that they define us and we succumb to the definitions. So define us anarchic and we start believing that we were anarchic before you came. Define us otherworldly and we start believing that we were otherworldly. A culture, a tradition which produced texts like Kam Sutra and Arthashastra, and they are not just ancient texts. Anangamala was written in 16th century, not in 4th or 5th century. Sukhniti Sar was written in 11th or 12th century. Raj Tarangani by Kalhan was written in 12th century. And these texts do not indicate a otherworldly society. These texts are secular in the best possible sense of the term. They deal with the problems of this world. Of course, with a certain perspective, which does not ignore the so-called other world or the world beyond your immediate perception. But we are an otherworldly society. We are a spiritual society. It's a long story. Let us not go into that. But 18th, 19th century Europe was desperately looking for a counterfoil of spirituality. And some of the philosophers, the so-called romantic philosophers, found that in India, and India to them became a kind of homeland of spirituality. This became part of European common sense, and they defined us that way, and we succumbed to the definition. Writing early in the 20th century, the Dayan of Hindi literary criticism and historiography, Ramchandra Sokri made a very interesting comment, very interesting observation. It was with reference to Vidyapati, the great Maithili poet. Now, Vidyapati has written a lot of erotic poetry. And under the influence of Victorian Puritan morality of sex, many people were feeling embarrassed about it. So they tried to give a kind of spiritual gloss to the eroticism of Vidyapati. And on that, Sukriji made a remarkable comment. आजकल आध्यात्मिक रंग के चश्मे बहुत सस्ते हो गए. यूरोप वालों ने कह दिया भारतवासी बड़े आध्यात्मिक होते हैं और बस दिखा चले अपनी आध्यात्मिक. The Europeans described them as spiritual, so Indians started proving their spirituality. The same observation made in a much more powerful way, which was made by Salman Rushdie in late 20th century. They define us and we succumb to the definitions. A serious engagement with 18th century, I hope, will help us to come out of this peculiar situation, where we succumb to the definitions given by those who were colonizing us. It is because of this that I am really interested in the activity of this society, and I hope this society will reflect and seriously think about the colonization. I repeat, colonization is the historical process without which you cannot understand 21st century, and you cannot imagine a better future for humankind as such, not only about India and Africa. So, keeping this in mind, I would like to talk. This is the broad framework in which I would like to situate my talk. This is the broad framework in which I would like you to reflect on whatever I'm going to say or other things. The other point I want to make is this. It was also because of the internalization of colonial paradigm and colonial episteme that we Indians started ignoring or rather feeling embarrassed about our immediate past. If you look at the historical research, historian K.N. Panikkar made this remark, I think 20 years ago, that the 18th century in Indian history remains a no man's land. People work on 15th, 16th, 17th century, people work on 19th century, 20th century. Hardly anybody bothers to work about 18th century. I'm very happy to say that there is a society which is focusing specifically on 18th century, and there are so many people, so many young scholars interested in various disciplines and creative expressions who are taking active interest in 18th century. I hope this society will take on the fundamental questions, not only about art and literature and gender discourse and things like that. They are important, of course, but the fundamental issue is the issue of colonization, the issue of colonialism. For the simple reason that colonization was not merely an economic blunder. Economist Utsa Patnaik has estimated recently that wealth worth $45 trillion was plundered by the British during their colonial rule. That's a staggering figure, $45 trillion. But not only the economic loot, the colonization also robbed us of our cultural memories, of our organic relationship with our society, and so on. So it's not merely economic plunder, it's also a cultural plunder. It's a cultural kind of, metaphorically speaking, it's a cultural genocide. And not merely metaphorically speaking. Those of you who have read this fascinating work by Mike Davis the Victorian Holocaust would know that in the last quarter of 19th century, that is between 1875 to 1900, more than 200 million people perished in man-made famines. And he has taken his data from British sources themselves. You just imagine what would have been the population of the Indian subcontinent in that period, and what percentage of that population perished in those famines which were man-made, and in which the Governor General instructed the lower officers not to indulge in humanitarian hysterics, not to help people, because that will make people depend on the government for any eventuality. So these things ought to be part of our consciousness. Unfortunately, they are not. It is in this context that I want to talk to you about vernacular modernity. Now, why the adjective vernacular before modernity? And why I am at all using the phrase modernity with reference to pre-colonial India or India under the process of being colonized? When I talk of vernacular modernity, it is in order to distinguish it from the native age. I am not using the phrase indigenous modernity. I am using the phrase vernacular. That is Desh Bhasha. I believe, and I have shown in my research, and not only me, other scholars also, for example, with reference to South India, Sanjay Subramaniam and Velchuri Narayan Rao has done great work by analyzing the Telugu and Tamil texts, and other scholars also who have worked on Marathi and Malayalam and all that. When I talk of vernacular, I am talking of these Desh Bhasas. And I feel very strongly that if you really want to understand the growth of Indian genius or the dynamics of Indian society, you cannot understand it adequately if your sources are confined to Sanskrit and Persian. In order to understand India, you have to engage with Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, Odia, whatever sources with a sense of respect. Then only you will understand what was really happening here. It is important to note, and I think any one of you, if reflects carefully, would agree. Let me just quote something which H.H. Wilson wrote in his famous text, An Introduction to the Religious Sects of Hindus, published as a kind of report in 1828 and 1832 in the Journal of Asiatic Society of Bengal, Kolkata. He wrote that there is no controversy on this, that the worldview and tradition of Hindus can be understood only through Sanskrit language. This has become such a common sense. This has become such a dominant view that you take it as a kind of God's word. But is it true? How many of us who are Hindus here actually have even seen the Vedas? Forget about reading. And how many of us, on the other side, are not aware or influenced in some way or the other by Ramcharitmanas, stroke Kabir Bijak, stroke Guru Granth Sahib, stroke Gyaneshwari, stroke Odia Mahabharat by Sarla Das, and so on and so forth. And mind you, none of these texts is merely a translation of the Sanskrit texts. Ramcharitmanas is not a translation of Valmiki Ramayana. It's not even a translation of Adhyatma Ramayana, from which it is greatly influenced. The Mahabharat by Odia Mahabharat by Sarla Das is not a translation of Sanskrit Mahabharata. It is certainly not a translation. The Adhyatma Ramayana in Malayalam by Aju Chatan is not a translation of Valmiki. All these vernacular classics are retelling of the stories, of the narratives available from the tradition. And they are original in the sense they are reflecting, they are responding to the problems, to the questions, to the issues faced by their own time. They are not merely restating whatever has been stated in Sanskrit sources. So the vernacular is extremely important if you really want to know what was happening, let us say in 15th century North India or 16th century North India. The Sanskrit sources are not going to help. Most certainly they are not going to help in that sense. So this is the reason of my emphasizing vernacular. Now what do we mean by modernity? When we talk of modernity, what do we mean by modernity? In my research work, I am very soon, my book on Kabir in English, it's not a translation of the book mentioned by Amba. It's not a translation of Fakat Khani Premki. It's an independent book. I think in April or May it will be out, available. So in the process of writing that book, I conducted a kind of thought experiment with a young boy. And I asked him that, what do you mean by modern? If I were to say modern or modernity, what would come to your mind? So he said that keeping in tune with the latest, contemporary, or keeping track of the important intellectual developments or progressive things. I asked him, I probed him further. For instance, immediately said, for example, Europe, USA. So Europe and USA are the template of modern. We have to become like them, or we have to follow them in order to be properly known as modern. This is quite natural given the fact that the theorization about modernity so far largely has been done on the basis of European historical experience. Sudipto Kaviraj wrote that interesting essay, A Revisionist Theory of Modernity, in which he pointed this out, that the available theories of modernity are based upon the historical experience of Europe. And in that sense, they are parochial. Because they do not really take in account the developments in other parts of the world. So if I, as an Indian, that is Sudipto Kaviraj, were to think of modernity, what do I do with my own cultural experience and memories of that? If you reflect on this, it will lead to exciting possibilities of redefining the very idea of modernity. Not in an essential sense, not in a fundamental sense. Let me make it extremely clear that I am not one of those who believe that human values or attitudes are only cultural specific. They are cultural specific, they are culture specific, but essentially there are certain human values and attitudes which are universal and ought to be universal. I have no sympathy whatsoever with cultural relativism. I do not believe that every culture is a grammar and every act of that culture is a sign in that grammar and you must understand that grammar. That's fine, fair enough. But everything has to be evaluated on the basis of certain universal human values. If equality is a human value, universal human value, then it has to be applied, even if giving some account, some space to local variations, it has to be applied universally. So I'm not at all talking of cultural universalism of postmodernist type. Let me make it extremely clear. So what do we mean by modernity? How do we define modernity? If you go naturally to Max Weber, the great theoretician of modernity, he has used a very interesting and very, to my mind, very appropriate expression. Disenchantment. He borrowed this expression from Friedrich Schiller, and he said disenchantment is something which makes the modern Europe different from the traditional. From disenchantment follows the desacralization. So what do we mean by disenchantment? Quite simply, disenchantment with the available narratives of society, of cosmos, of the nature of relationship of human being with his surroundings or her surroundings. So the available interpretations are not sufficient. The human being started feeling disenchanted with those interpretations. And that was the beginning of early modernity in Europe, that is 15th, 16th century. Then there is this desacralization. The idea of sacred was interrogated. What is sacred? Whatever the Pope says is sacred. Whatever the church dictates is sacred because it has the divine sanction. Because church happens to be the body of God. Church happens to be the bride of Christ. And therefore you cannot question. This was questioned. Indulgence. The promises, the certificates issued by church on behalf of God Almighty in exchange of a hefty payment, of course, that this man or this woman has paid sufficiently for your church. So, oh Lord, in your heaven, give him a good place. Give him a berth in a first class sleeper, not in second class or certainly not in Janta class. So this was called indulgence. Martin Luther opposed this practice. He protested against it, hence the Protestant church. So, and also, the kings and princes insisted on their autonomy. So desacralization led to secularization of politics. Break between church and state. And that is why the secular idea of politics, the secular idea of statecraft, that is without divine intervention. You cannot claim divine intervention as the basis of your politics. That is the modern view of politics. Whatever you do, you have to justify it in terms of what? There comes the third point. Rationality. So rationality, not merely in the sense of crude pragmatism, but in the sense of recognizing the importance of a proof, epistemological proof, which is open to debate. You see, you cannot argue against God. If I were to tell you that whatever I'm saying is God's word, God is speaking through my mouth. And if you question me, if you interrogate me, if you disagree with me, you are committing a sin. This is not a rational argument. The best one could say about this is a faith argument. So the idea of rational proof, the idea of proof which is open to question and which is rooted in experience, not in scripture. Just because something is written in particular scripture or particular dharma shastra, I'm not going to accept it. You have to convince me. You have to appeal to my reason. You have to prove that this is true going by your experience. That is empirical proof, empirical nature of proof. And these are philosophical or abstract things. Concrete level, vernacularization of religious and secular discourse. Till only 400 years ago or 500 years ago, English and French and German were also called vernacular with the similar disdain with which today Hindi, Bengali or Tamil are called vernacular. Vernacular literally means the speech of village rustics. In Latin, vernacular means the speech, the language of unsophisticated, uneducated village rustics. Just as Sanskrit and Prakrit or Pali literally means Dehati. So Dehati Bhasha is Pali, Prakrit is unsophisticated, as it is natural, Sanskrit is cultured. So similarly, vernacular till 15th century in Europe was a rather contemptuous expression. It was in these vernaculars that the word of God, that is the Bible, was translated. In these centuries, starting from 13th to 18th century, English, French, German, and so on. The monopoly on the divinity, the monopoly of divine wisdom enjoyed by church was broken. The religious discourse, the sacred discourse was vernacularized. These are essential features of modernity. It is extremely important, my dear friends. I hope most of you are students of history. It is extremely important to remind ourselves that industrialization follows early modernity. It does not precede it. There are certain changes in attitudes. There are a spread of commerce, huge spread of commerce for a variety of reasons, which leads to a situation, and colonization also plays a role in that Europe is industrialized. It is not as if Europe was first industrialized and then modernized. Early modernity comes first, industrialization comes later. So, if we were to identify these features, rightly so, as the defining features, defining characteristics of modernity, then the second question comes, was modernity an exclusively European export to other places? I mean, this has been the commonsensical understanding till 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and for some people it is the commonsensical understanding even now. And that is why some people feel that colonization was quite a historically progressive process. Because colonization, in spite of all its brutality, all its torturous plunder, after all brought the static societies, the ahistorical societies into the flow of history. But for British colonization, India would not have been modernized. That was the dominant understanding, and it still continues to be, if not dominant, certainly a widespread understanding. I have been trying to, and not only me, many scholars before me in Hindi. I work in Hindi primarily, in Hindi and in other languages and in other disciplines, have been interrogating this understanding for quite some time. I mentioned Sanjay Subramaniam and Velichuri Narayan Rao. In Hindi, decades ago, Ramvilas Sharma questioned this understanding. He argued that if you look at the spread of commerce, then the so-called medieval India had a great spread of commerce, and things were changing, attitudes were changing, and so on and so forth. So the question is that do we see these symptoms, these characteristics working somewhere in Indian history? And there comes the second part of the title of my talk, Bhakti Poetry. If you read Bhakti poetry, then you find that it is not they are, as I told you, forget about Kabir, etc. They were in any case interrogative souls. They did not bother about the scriptures in any case. But even someone like Tulsidas is not translating Valmiki Ramayana. This is extremely crucial to remember. I was just, as you know, I'm quite active in social media also these days. So I was reading a conversation on Twitter between two individuals. So this man or boy quoted something from, was it Narsi Mehta or Tulsidas or something? Quoted something from a vernacular poet. This man, who is quite expectedly a technology man, IT man, based in USA, again quite expected, because most of the very proud Hindus have chosen to leave the land of Hindu Dharma and have settled in, have opted for green card and greener pastures. So most of them live in USA and they preach Hindu Dharma to us who live in India. So anyway, so this person challenges him. No, I don't bother about this. Quote something from Sanskrit. I didn't want to intervene. I was not part of the conversation, but I felt like telling him that thank God, you should thank God that he's quoting from Tulsidas, not from Valmiki Ramayana. If he were to quote from Valmiki Ramayana, your idea of Ram Rajya will be seriously problematized. Tulsidas, for his own reasons, has omitted the parts of Valmiki Ramayana which would embarrass this American Hindu today no end. In Tulsidas' Ramcharitmanas, after they come back from Lanka, they come to Ayodhya, they live happily ever after. Perfect couple, perfect family, everything is perfect. Daihik, Devik, Bhautik, Tapa, Ram, Raj, Kahu, Nahi Pyapa. It's a perfect utopia. Not in Valmiki. In Valmiki, the agonizing events take place after they come back. Sita is expelled. Ram suffers deep guilt. Those who know Valmiki Ramayana will know that how agonizing the later part of Valmiki Ramayana are. Tulsidas is not translating Valmiki Ramayana. He is making his choices. He is reconstructing the story. And not only the story, he is reconstructing the descriptions. Valmiki has no inhibitions in describing the female form, the female beauty, and the sexual act. Tulsidas says. He avoids all that. On the other hand, Sarla Das, Odiya Mahabharat, he is also not translating Vyas Mahabharat. He is making his choices. So, Mr. H.H. Wilson was fundamentally wrong when he said that in order to understand the Hindu tradition, Hindu psyche, there is no need to know anything except Sanskrit. It's patently wrong. Irony is that this colonial paradigm has been internalized by us to that extent that this man is challenging this person to show something in Sanskrit. So if this particular thing is not Sanskrit, it is not authentic. Interestingly, this idea of authenticity, if you study the so-called medieval sources, I prefer to call them early modern sources. To my mind, Kabir and Tulsidas are situated in early modernity of India, not in medieval times. This kind of epistemological primacy to Sanskrit sources is not given in those days. This is quite interesting. So when we talk of vernacular modernity, when I talk of vernacular modernity, I keep this thing in mind. the importance, the crucial importance of Varna. It's my favorite example, favorite metaphor one can say. And those who have maybe heard it might feel a sense of repetition, listening to something repeated, being repeated, but those who have not, you must have seen this famous film Guide, Vijayanand film. Devanand is playing the guide, Raju Guide. I'm sure you have seen it. And if not, you must see it. Not for the thing I'm going to say, not only for that, but also because it's a good film. But there is a particular scene in that film, which obviously the director did not intend to be supporting evidence for my argument, but it has become. That scene says something very interesting. And I draw a very significant conclusion from that. The scene is that Raju Guide, after being released from prison, reaches this particular village, and because of his calm and helpful nature, earns the respect of villagers. He is seen as a sadhu. And villagers start giving him gifts, presents, taking care of him. He becomes a kind of sadhu for them. Local priests are very upset because of this. Because they are not only their respect and reputation, but also their very subsistence is threatened because of Raju Guide's existence. So they decide to expose him. So it so happens that one day they cite a slok from mantra from Isava Suknisat, Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachayate, etc. So they challenge him to translate it or interpret it. They cite this mantra and challenge him to interpret it. Where Raju has no Sanskrit. He has never learned Sanskrit. He just cannot respond. So the priests are very happy. They have defeated him, they have humiliated him, they are very happy. Bolenge kya Sanskrit aati ho tab na? Now it becomes a question not only of existence, physical existence, but also of self-respect for Raju. He bursts out in English. He says something, 2 or 3 sentences, 4 sentences in English, says whatever, and then challenges the priests. बताइए कुछ समझ आया? बेचारे पुरोहित तो उनको अंग्रेजी नहीं आती, वो चुप रह जाते हैं. तो राजू कहता है बोलेंगे क्या, अंग्रेजी आती हो तब ना. Friends, my point is this, that you cannot understand India if you do not care to listen to those who neither speak the language of gods, that is Sanskrit, or language of lords, that is Persian or English. This was true in 15th century, this was true in 18th century, and this is true in 21st century. Unless you go with respect, and respect does not mean andhbhakti, respect does not rule out critical engagement, but unless you go with a desire to critically, even if respectfully, engage with vernacular sources, you just cannot understand the dynamics of Indian society. I'm absolutely sure. You just cannot understand it. For example, just to give you one example, Amba mentioned my book Hindi Sarai Astrakhan via Yerevan. Now Astrakhan is a city in Russia, 300 kilometers south of Moscow on the bank of Volga. And it was a major trade center from 15th to up to even 19th century. And I became interested in Astrakhan while reading Discovery of India years ago. In Discovery of India, Jawaharlal ji writes in a footnote that a friend has brought some documents to my notice which tell about the Hindi Sarai, which was built by local authorities for the facility and benefit of Indian traders settled in Astrakhan. This stayed with me when I was working on my book, Akat Kahani Prem Ki. I had been working on it for quite some time, for 30 years actually. So, but I could not explore it much in that book. The book was already going beyond what publisher could handle. But this was there in my mind. And I got a chance to visit Russia and Armenia in 2011, or was it 12? I think 2011. And I visited Astrakhan. The first non-Russian scholar who worked with archives of Astrakhan in Russian language is Dr. Surendra Gopal of Patna University. He's a very old man now, but he wrote fascinating papers about the Indian traders settled in Astrakhan. Then Cambridge historian Stephen Dale, he published his work in 1994 and mentioned that Surendra Gopal was the first non-Russian historian to realize the significance of these documents. Professor Dale was not allowed to visit Russia, so he could not actually consult the archives and had to work on the basis of whatever was available in libraries in UK and Europe. I was fortunate enough to visit the archives. Very briefly, but still I could visit the archives. And with the help of a Russian knowing friend, I could, in a way, read the papers there, the documents. All of them are in Russian. This friend translated those for me in English and Hindi. And it is fascinating. Why it is fascinating? We were told, and we are still told, that the Hindus observed a taboo on seafaring. समुद्र पार करने पर हिंदुओं की जात चली जाती थी, इसलिए हिंदू कभी समुद्र पार नहीं करते थे, बहुत इंसुलर हो गए थे. अच्छा, पहले कभी करते होंगे इन अर्ली पीरियड्स, जब रोम वगैरह के साथ व्यापार करते थे तब करते होंगे, बट आफ्टर 6th or 7th century somehow they developed this taboo and they stopped crossing sea, or whatever trade was taking place in so-called medieval period under Mughal or other administrations, the Samudra Par business was done by Muslims. Hindus never crossed the sea. At best they worked as clerks, as munsis, munims, but they never ventured into the sea because it was against their religious tradition. It was a taboo for them. I knew even before visiting Astrakhan that this is nothing but bullshit. I'm sorry for the expression, but this is what it is. This Astrakhan archives not only confirmed my view, they opened a new world for me. These are fascinating archives. The Russian authorities have kept meticulous records, detailed, of at least 200 traders settled almost permanently in Astrakhan. Most of those traders, almost every one of them, is from Gujarat, Multan and Punjab. None of them is from south of India. They are Gujarat, Punjab and Multan. And mind you, none of them is a Muslim. All of them are Hindus. And in those archives, the word Baniya is not used to indicate a caste, but it is used to indicate a profession. Being a Hindi speaker myself, being an Indian myself, I could see that people with certainly non-Baniya surnames have been entered in those archives as Baniyas. And these are Hindus. None of them is a Muslim. The building in Israel still survives. I visited it. It had a kind of makeshift temple. The French and Russian travelers have written about that temple. I have mentioned those things in my book, Hindi Sarai Astrakhan via Yerevan. The worship they describe is clearly a Vaishnava worship. The temple is described as Thakur Dwara. Anybody from North India would immediately recognize Thakur Dwara. That is what a mandir is still called in Rajasthan. Bhagwan, the traditional Rajasthani or Western Indian hardly uses the expression Bhagwan. He uses the expression Thakurji. ठाकुर जी को स्नान कराया, ठाकुर जी का प्रसाद लिया. So this is Thakur Dwara. Thakur Dwara. And the whole description, you read, it's a Vaishnav description. Now, it is not as if these traders settled there and lost touch entirely with their land and became Jatvar. No, that is not the case. The documents make it very clear that they used to travel between India and Russia. And in fact, there is a moving story, and in fact, a very significant, in a sense, funny and in a sense, very moving story. Not a story, in fact, I should say, moving event noted in those, incident noted in those documents, in those archives. As we know, for all kind of ritual and religious purposes, Hindus need Ganga Jal. So how much Ganga Jal can you store? You need Ganga Jal for your puja, you need Ganga Jal for your caste rites, you need Ganga Jal for this, you need Ganga Jal for that. So how much Ganga Jal can you import from India and how much can you store? So once it so happened that they took some Ganga Jal from Varanasi and put that Ganga Jal in Volga. So Volga Jal from that day onwards became Ganga Jal. And they started using the Volga water for their religious purposes. They used to invite the priests, in fact some Granthis also, Sikh Granthis, and send them back. They would stay for some time, they would come back. Nobody lost their caste. Nobody lost their status. They were not forced to marry amongst themselves. And they were so influential, not in the local trade of Astrakhan, but also in the imperial court in Moscow, that the local governor issued a decree duly endorsed by imperial court in Moscow that anybody harassing these cow worshippers, you mind the expression, cow worshippers, will be dealt with severely. They are under the protection of His Excellency Tsar. Of course, it was a warning to local fundamentalist Christians or those kind of people. So this was starting from 16th to 19th century. After 19th century, all of a sudden, we lose all trace of Astrakhan Vyapari. To my mind, this is the challenge for the historical research. What happened? Something happened in 18th century India, culminating in 19th century India. The British paramountcy, the British administration, which not only changed the political system, it also deliberately distorted the cultural self-understanding of Indians, of Hindus and Muslims alike, which created, as Raymond Schwab, you must read this book, my dear young friends, the Oriental Renaissance, Europe's discovery of India and the Orient. This book was published in French in 1950, written by Raymond Schwab, translated in English, unfortunately, in 1984, only 34 years after its first publication in French. And Raymond Schwab makes a remarkable statement. He says that Brahmin is suitable for export was constructed. Contrary to the view of some people that Hinduism was constructed in 19th century. No. Hinduism was not constructed. This kind of Brahminism, this kind of orthodoxy was constructed and presented as the tradition. Contrary to all available evidences. Yes. Seafaring might have been a taboo amongst Brahmins of eastern India. Maybe eastern Uttar Pradesh of today, Bihar, Bengal. Certainly not among the trading castes of West and South India. It was certainly not a taboo amongst the West and South India trading castes. The famous Bhakt poet of Gujarat, Pranath, was a trader himself and used to travel to Middle East by sea many times. One of the Astrakhan traders, Barayev, describes various routes between India and Russia. Sea route is one of them. It is not all surface routes. So the point I'm trying to make is this. that if you believe that modernity is about individuality, if it is about rationality, if it is about vernacularization of sacred and secular knowledge, then 15th, 16th century India was not medieval. In Europe, the word of God was translated in vernacular. In India, the Bhakt poets made God speak vernacular. There's a moving reference at the beginning of Gyaneswari by Gyandev Maharaj. Arjun tells Krishna that, look, sir, I do not understand Sanskrit. So whatever you want to tell me, whatever you want to give me, please give it in Marathi. This is Gyaneswari. The Tika by Gyaneswar. In fact, the Tika is not a Tika. It's actually an original reflection. Gita has only 700 odd slokas. Gyaneswari by Gyaneswar has 9,000 odd. So the point I'm trying to make is this, that if you do not confuse modernity with industrialization, if you do not confuse modernity with physical and material achievements only, if you focus modernity as an attitude, then the vernacular sources tell you a very different story. Just at the end, because it's already, I just noticed it's 7:20 past 5. I think it was in 1983, this book was published, Cambridge Economic History of India. And in its probably second volume, Professor Tapan Rai Chaudhary wrote an article, a chapter about India just before the establishment of colonial power, that is 18th century. And he wrote in that in detail about the spread of commerce. He wrote about the Hundi system. He wrote about, in fact, he wrote that something like joint stock companies were developing here. The Hundi system was there. There is a lot of circulation of cash, and so on and so forth. Yet, the social attitudes were almost the same as were during the time of Marco Polo's visit to India. And in such a situation, the spontaneous move towards industrialization was impossible. So the move towards industrialization had to be instigated or to be inspired from outside. The progressive role, objectively progressive role of British rule. Now the question which one would like to ask is this,